it's not just a passion for the mission. It's really about passion for the work and advancing the mission for that organization. That's what you're looking for. And you have to have the right board members in place, but that's only part one of what you need to do. Part two for the executive directors out there is use your board. Don't just rely on them to approve the budget and sort of rubber stamp kind of different initiatives. Use them. They're usually some really thoughtful, intelligent, experienced people on that board with all sorts of experiences and backgrounds that you might not have as an executive that you can benefit from. So talk with individual board members between board meetings, invite their input, have, working committees that can really help make some of your important decisions over time.
You're listening to the Nonprofit Counsel podcast with host May Harris.
Welcome to the Nonprofit Counsel podcast. Today, my guest is attorney Jean Takagi, who is the founder of NEO Law Group up in San Francisco, as well as the prolific writer for the Nonprofit Law blog. Is that correct? Did I get that right, Jean?
That's perfect.
Okay. And you have been doing this for close to 20 years, if I'm correct. Is that the case?
That's right. I believe I started the firm in 2005.
Wow. Well, congratulations. I don't know if you know this or not, but you are definitely someone who inspired me to enter into this sector. So if I haven't had a chance to thank you before, I wanted to thank you here. But maybe for the benefit of our audience, you could tell us a little bit about how you did get into representing tax-exempt organizations.
Sure, May. And thank you for the kind words. It's been a pretty roundabout journey for me, but I think the lesson that some have gotten from looking at my journey is just to keep moving forward, and everything you've done in your past may somehow connect to what you do in your future. But I started if I take us back a little bit, in college, I was studying pre-med and decided then I didn't want to go to medical school. And so I switched my majors to zoology and oceanography, and I was going to be a marine biologist working at Scripps. But that didn't pan out either, because I was really bad at applied research. I would spill all these carcinogenic chemicals on my hands and stuff. And so that didn't work out very well. And so then I just went on this exploration of what jobs could I do. And I got into management. I sold insurance door to door. I sold diamonds for a Belgian cutting factory. I worked in retail sales, first as a cashier, and ultimately I ended up being operations manager of the duty-free business in San Francisco. And I stayed there for about 5 years, and our contract was up, and I had to lay off all of the staff when our contract was up, because it's only one vendor per city. And, there was about 150 staff members. So it was hard on my heart, because I still had a job doing new business development throughout the country for our firm, which was the second largest global retailer at that time in the duty-free industry. But it made me think about what I wanted to do. I was working pretty hard, like 60, 70, 80-hour weeks, and decided, well, if I'm going to do that, I just don't really want to do it if I don't really believe in the work. And like many of us, I'm sure we wanted to do something more meaningful in our lives. And
Absolutely.
I decided I wanted to work with nonprofits. And so I shifted from managing kind of a retail business, which was kind of a $50 million a year business in the mid-90s, I guess, and decided I wanted to manage in the nonprofit sector. And I did that for about 3 years, and found that I wanted to progress higher, but I didn't have a fundraising background. So in order to sort of get the type of jobs that I wanted, and in my mind, with my school background, I was like, I'd love to be the executive director of the Monterey Bay Aquarium, or the Museum of Natural History. I'm still dreaming back then. And I thought, well, a law degree might be an an interesting way to sort of get into these positions, because I will never meet the fundraising background that others would have with comparable management experience, because I was working in the for-profit sector for 10, 15 years. So thought, okay, I'll do a law degree. Never intended to become a lawyer when I was in law school. I thought I was going to just use it in management. But decided during law school that, it was expensive, and it's so much more expensive now. So I empathize with students now.
Absolutely. It's insane.
But it was still expensive, and I sold a condo to go to law school. So I was like, okay, let me see what it's like to be a lawyer and make, a little bit of money. So I worked for a big firm for about 3.5 years. And always with an eye on, I'm going to eventually work to serve nonprofit organizations, because that's where my passion lied. And after 3.5 years, I set up my own shingle, and off it went. And this is now 18 years later, and almost 19.
Almost 19. Yeah. I was looking at that's pretty impressive. So going to law school was kind of just I won't say an afterthought, but just a stepping stone on your way to do what you really feel is important.
Yeah. And I should add that I went to grad school in nonprofit management right after laying everybody off, which was, again, horrible. But that was part of the journey of trying to see what I wanted to do. And it really spoke to me to work with nonprofit organizations, which when you think about it, and I think this applies to almost everybody, nonprofits probably played a big part of our lives growing up. We might not think about it, but, from church to the YMCA to kind of, visiting.
Girl Scouts and Boy Scouts and everything.
Exactly. And so I thought, that really spoke to me.
Right. So you did your master's in nonprofit management, leadership and management before law school, or the other way around?
Before law school.
So you and I have a very similar educational background. I just did it the other way around. I went to law school first, then decided, working in-house for a big corporation wasn't for me. And so then I went back to the nonprofits sector and realized I didn't know enough on the fundraising part, on the management part, and went back and got a master's. So very similar. But the thing that strikes me is, our stories aren't that far from the stories of the people we serve and the organizations and the founders we serve. We have been driven to do what we do because we have a passion for giving back and making change. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, absolutely, May. I feel like when law students come to me, or people thinking about entering into the law because they see the type of work that you and I do, and they want us to talk about it, I always sort of beam about our kind of practice area and say, I think we're probably the happiest group of lawyers in any practice area, because we find our work so fulfilling, and the organizations and clients we work with are incredible. And
we get to be a part of their journey, which you're right. I can't imagine practicing any other area of law. I thought in law school that I was going to become a patent attorney, because somewhat like you, I had a STEM undergrad. I was geology and geological engineering. And I was like, I'll just become a patent lawyer. I couldn't think of anything worse in the long run for my personality trait than now looking back at that. So I don't know what I was thinking as a young law student, but being able to serve purpose-driven, leading the way, community-based organizations has been so fulfilling from a career perspective. So I'm sure you get calls every day, just like I do, about organizations that want to start a nonprofit in California. And I often tell them that California is a great place to start a nonprofit, but it's also one of the more challenging ones. It has a great corporations code that's specifically tailored to nonprofits. This is for all the people who like to call me and say, doesn't everyone form in Delaware? The answer is no. If you're a nonprofit organization, you want to form where you're going to be operating. So maybe we can kind of delve into, the kind of unique things about starting a nonprofit in California. So if I were calling you, Jean, and I'd say, okay, I want to start a nonprofit, what's kind of the process I have to look at and things I need to be aware of in California?
So I think, I agree with much of what you said, May, in terms of some people think, well, I've always heard Delaware is the place to form corporations. And that may be true for sort of for-profit corporations that intend to go public. But that's a very small subset of corporations. And that doesn't include nonprofit corporations at all. Sometimes Delaware's got that flexibility for private foundations that they might find helpful in terms of not providing for many default sections in terms of how you govern an organization. And California has a lot of default rules, as you said, but I consider that a big plus for most charities, especially charities that can't afford in-house counsel, because the default rules ensure that there's something to fall back on if you didn't anticipate that and didn't put it into your governing documents. And it says, well, if you haven't written exactly how, this decision is going to be made or what type of quorum we need or whatever, it's spelled out in the code. And that makes things just so much more simpler. California is also great, in my opinion, because it requires that organizations manage conflict of interest transactions in a specific way. So if you don't do it in the right way, where there is a board member who has a material financial interest in some transaction with the nonprofit, the organization could get in trouble. But without that default rule, you could still get in trouble under federal law, under 501c3 laws. So the California laws just sort of set it up in a nice way that you can anticipate some of those things. You can put them into your governing documents because you know what the rules are. And that makes it just a little bit easier. There's an audit requirement in California, but it's with fairly generous limits, triggered at $2 million. And there's some nuance to that. But that's also, I think for the public, in terms of public trust, a good thing to know that, if you're a larger nonprofit, that you're required to have an external audit, independent audit. And, there are some rules in terms of like how much or what percentage of your board must be independent directors and not compensated by the organization. And again, to have a majority of board members who are not receiving compensation from the organization, whether as an employee or independent contractor, I feel like if I'm an employee or a donor or another stakeholder of that organization, that's an organization I feel I can trust a little bit more than if all the board members are also, have financial deals with the organization. So those type of California laws where some people might say it's a little bit more restrictive than states like in Delaware or otherwise, I think are good things.
I think they are too, because at the end of the day, these are charitable assets. They're the public's property, not individuals, and it shouldn't be. The organization shouldn't be used to enrich private individuals or their businesses or their spouses' businesses or their brothers' businesses. It goes down the line that way. So, you mentioned that, a lot of organizations might say, oh, well, 501c3, the IRS code is the kind of, they definitely need to be aware of it. But really, they're established on the state level first. And so they have the whole statutory scheme of the state first, and then they have their tax status, hopefully preferential exempt org status. There are lots of states, I practice also in other states. I'm barred in DC and we have an office in Wyoming, for example. Wyoming, there's no state exemption that you have to get, and you don't have to register with an attorney general or a secretary of state or anything like that for charitable solicitation. And that's one area that I do think, and I agree with you, California is ahead of the game in best practice, and they've just kind of they've codified it. And the reports you have to do are best practice. So the California Attorney General has primary oversight over charitable assets in the state of California. And so, as you know, you have to do an initial registration with their office and then annual filings that ask some really interesting questions that some of them are on the 990 if you have to file a full 990, but some of them aren't. Maybe we can go into charitable oversight of the California Attorney General's office a little bit and what that looks like for charities.
Sure. And I absolutely agree with you that the many organizations and even some of their pro bono lawyers or lawyers on the board that practice in other areas of the law think, if you comply with 501c3, that's sort of the end of the game. You don't need to worry too much about state law because state law will mirror the federal tax law. And that's not true at all, right?
No, it's not at all.
And the same thing goes for enforcement of these laws. So the IRS has been a little bit behind, I would say.
Yeah, well, they haven't been provided a great deal of resources, for one thing. But yes, they're very behind. And yeah, go ahead and continue.
Yeah. And, I would say part of that is also with sort of the aging of some of the experts in our regulatory bodies. When budgets were cut, people continued, especially in the baby boom generation, continued to retire. And there weren't people who were brought back in during those times to replace them. And gradually the expertise in that office, as well as sort of the number of individuals there to regulate, nearly a couple million charities, right? Registered charities, is really a Herculean task for the IRS. But states differ in terms of their their enforcement. But California is one of those states that actually has pretty good resources for its charities division of the Attorney General's office. And so, I think in comparison to other states in the country, some of that only have like the equivalent of one full-time employee to regulate all the charities in that state, right? Yes. California is pretty advanced, with respect. They still have an incredible burden of monitoring a ton of charities with limited resources, but they actually do quite a bit of enforcement. And for a charitable organization, and stewards of those charitable assets that board members are, I think that's a good thing. So yes, the California Attorney General is fairly active. They especially want to know if assets have been diverted from their charitable purpose and used for other things. And that's not just sort of theft and fraud. It can go deeper than that. So if you misuse assets, and even if it's for a charitable purpose, but if it's outside of the mission of the organization, the stated mission and its governing documents, that's a diversion of charitable assets. If it's a payment to somebody in recognition of what they've done in the past, but there is no legal obligation to make that payment, and it's not part of a charitable grant-making program, and that person is not a charitable beneficiary, an ordinary charitable beneficiary of that charitable program, well, that might be a diversion of charitable assets as well. And there's a lot more to say about some of those things. So I don't mean to oversimplify, but diversions can take a lot of different shapes. And sometimes it's not just monetary assets. It is a for-profit organization that's affiliated with the nonprofit that's suddenly getting all of the contracts of the nonprofit going to that for-profit without sort of bidding or exploring what its competitors might offer to that nonprofit. And so there are other ways that the Attorney General will be looking to see, are the board members of that nonprofit acting in the best interest of the organization with an eye on its mission? Or are they doing things for other private interests where it's more than incidental to what they're doing? And that sort of dovetails with federal law, but I think the state regulators are looking at the same things. Absolutely.
And, they actually require organizations and their board of directors to kind of come clean. I mean, they have a duty to, if they become aware of this, inadvertent or not, you have to disclose that. You have to alert the Attorney General. The other way that the Attorney General gets information are through whistleblower complaints. And I think we've seen a rise in those because I think the public and donors are taking more and more of an interest in how their funds are spent, and they take ownership in nonprofit organizations. And we've seen a rise in, you've done this for almost 20 years. I've done it for not quite that long, but the evolution of the Attorney General over the past decade to 2 decades has been phenomenal, in my opinion. The enforcement, we would get clients that needed to finally register. They realized that they needed to finally register, and they'd been 10 years without registering, and the Attorney General hadn't sent them a notice to register, and they were just flying under the radar. But I think the Attorney General's getting up to speed on that. So when new organizations, at least, are coming on board, they're getting a notice to register. Are you kind of noticing that in your practice as well?
Absolutely, May. So yes, there's been increasing enforcement. I think part of it has to do with kind of just how our society has been advancing with technology. And some might not say there are always advances, but with media being 24 hours on every kind of media, including all sorts of social media channels, reports of wrongdoing is kind of an attractive seller of certain media to get more eyes on what they're doing. And so, yes, people are paying more attention, and that has some good sides and bad sides to it, in my opinion. So, on the good part is it alerts the Attorney General to more instances where there may be strong indicia that there has been something wrongful being done at a charity and a misuse of charity assets. On the other hand, sometimes when they're not really substantiated, or people can make kind of anonymous claims without, sticking out their necks to say, yes, I can substantiate this. Yes, there is evidence that this is, wrong, and just are doing it by, I think this is happening, and then can just blow it up and share it on social media channels that can go viral. It's a dangerous part of enforcement, because what can happen is that laws can be made based on this erroneous data, because legislators get, these media reports from varying sources, and newspapers are so valuable to what they contribute to us. But if they are reporting, with an eye on bad acts and scandals sell more papers than the good acts of charities, well, that really gives the public and legislators the wrong idea when they think about charities. So it really is up to the charitable sector to start to sort of make their own works better known and advocate, for their missions.
Oh, I couldn't agree more. So, nonprofit organizations can be their strongest asset themselves and how they practice and how they operate. They can also be their strongest enemy. So when a charity regulator comes knocking, whether it's in very rare circumstances, the IRS, or in more likely scenarios, the Attorney General, if you have your ducks in a row, you have your meeting minutes, you have your policies, your procedures, everything, your grants, your decisions, your contracts, and you have done it methodically and in compliance with your bylaws, you're so way ahead of the game, and you're in a better position to combat those types of media outlets when they come calling.
100%. Yeah. Agree with that. And it's, if people put themselves in the shoes of a regulator, when you see things that have been prepared just because you asked for it and they weren't there before, it's treated with a little bit more suspicion. You could sort of get that there's a little bit more suspicion to that than if there was a great record that was being tracked in a timely manner as it was happening. And you can see that there were systems and policies in place that were being complied with that tried to protect the charity and do the best things for the charity. So I agree with you 100%. Having all of those things in order is just it puts you so far ahead of the game of most charities.
Right. So there is some tension there, of course. I've talked with previous guests about the overhead myth, and you need to limit your overhead and spend everything on program. But ultimately, I think you probably agree with me that there has to be at least some spent on operations and overhead to ensure this kind of tracking, reporting, compliance. You can't, I don't think it necessarily is in the best interest of a nonprofit, in my opinion, to put all of their funding into program and nothing into administration and making sure these things are in compliance is taken care of. Would you agree with that? Because I think that is kind of a catch-22 with organizations. They get all this pressure from funders, like spend, the least amount possible on overhead, and say everything that we gave you went to program, when there are real compliance issues to take care of.
I do agree strongly with that, May, and I am a strong advocate of those who tried to send the message out about the overhead myth. The percentage of overhead, the amount of money that you spend on administration and fundraising versus on program, is such an overstated metric. It's not completely without importance, of course, but
of course,
if you build programs on a very shaky infrastructure, that program may fall. As you build and evolve over time, if you don't have a solid infrastructure, just as in the case in almost anything else we can think of, if you've got a shaky infrastructure, it's going to eventually collapse. And just having good people in place right now doesn't mean that the same people that have an understanding of what was built and why it was built that way 10 years from now can continue to understand all of that. And if it's shaky, it can collapse. And building strong infrastructure for compliance reasons, and also for the ability to maybe scale up your programming if you want to help more beneficiaries over time. Having a solid base, a solid foundation is just so important. So I agree with you 1,000%, May.
Well, it's awesome to be in agreement. If you were to share, 2 to 3 top tips for nonprofits, either starting or within their first 5 years of operations, what would it be?
So I'll start with, this is a fun topic. Let me start by saying, and then I'm going to end up with more than 3, but I'll
That's
just
okay.
share 3. Let's start with the mission, first of all, and what that means. So a mission statement may often be an expression of what you want the organization to do, why it exists, why donors are going to give money to you, why funders are going to give you grants. That's the expression. And when you define your mission and you put it into your governing documents, your articles and bylaws, you've created a legal restriction for yourself in terms of, well, this is what you have to operate for the purposes, that are expressed in your mission statement in those governing documents. And you can't really act outside of those boundaries in any substantial manner. So having the right mission statement that allows you to grow over time without necessarily having to amend your governing documents can be very important, because they have implications in terms of how you use your monies as well. So just to give you an example, a concrete example, if your mission is to help persons experiencing homelessness in Los Angeles, and all of a sudden you get a big grant opportunity to work in an adjoining county in Riverside, let's say. If your governing documents just say Los Angeles and you're constrained to that, you can't do that without amending your governing documents. And you can't use any past acquired assets for that new mission statement if you change your mission. So you want to think about the mission statement very, very carefully, and what you're going to put in your governing documents, what you're going to express to the IRS when you state it in your Form 990 for the year, what you're putting on your website and your grant applications. And something that's been developing in my mind over the last couple of years is to sort of express a value statement in your mission may be very important as well if you want to anchor certain values. So you'll find some lawyers and others that will say things like, well, if you're going to act in the best interest of the organization when you're a board member, it has to be for the organization's best interest only. And that may be to the exclusiveness is what's in the best interest of the beneficiaries that you're trying to serve, what's in the best interest of the community that you're in. And that can lead to all sorts of bad results if you're just focused on advancing your mission as far as you can without paying attention to anything else. And, in my persons experiencing homelessness example, does that mean like just providing resources for those individuals without any consideration of preserving dignity for those populations you serve? If you can get more people served by not, taking into account your values, is that what you should do? And I don't think that that's what you should do. I think you should make sure that you're honoring your values as well. So how to codify that is something I've been thinking a little bit more about within your mission statement. And there's a great governance principle or governance structure that's being promoted by an organization called Board Source. And just full disclosure, I'm one of the board members of Board Source. It's called purpose-driven board leadership. And it talks about advancing the best interests of your organization with an eye on the ecosystem, with an eye on equity, to make sure that, okay, if serving, the most people is advancing the mission, but you're only serving one type of individual or group of people at the exclusion of others who might be more under the, or more off the radar, is that really, fulfilling the best interest of the organization? And I think that may not be in most cases. So those things are really important. So let me stop there and say that was my one tip.
That was an excellent tip because it actually spans so much of an organization's life cycle, from starting up to maturing as you grow, having a purpose statement, mission statement that is broad enough to capture what your goals are is so important, but narrow enough that it really explains what you do and what you're planning to do. And I've seen this again and again with organizations that, we're charitable, we're under C3, so that's good enough. Well, no, it really isn't. So it's a point well taken that there needs to be some real thought put into that statement that has to go into your governing documents, on your website, in your case for support, in all of your development materials. It needs to be really well thought out. And it's something that has to be well thought out at the beginning, which it's not something you can just kind of amend on the fly. You can amend, but it's not all that easy sometimes.
And limiting to some extent as well. So I agree.
Okay, so let's do one more because I think we have time for one more of Jean's tips.
Great. So I would say my second tip is build the right board for your organization. And just believing in the mission is not good enough. Okay, dedicated to the mission. No, Jan Masaoka, who's the current CEO of Cal Nonprofits, but she'll be leaving, I think, at the end of the year.
And she will be so missed. So missed.
Yeah, she will be. She's a force of nature in the nonprofit sector, in the California nonprofit sector. But I heard her once say, it's not just a passion for the mission. It's really about passion for the work and advancing the mission for that organization. That's what you're looking for. And you have to have the right board members in place, but that's only part one of what you need to do. Part two for the executive directors out there is use your board. Don't just rely on them to approve the budget and sort of rubber stamp kind of different initiatives. Use them. They're usually some really thoughtful, intelligent, experienced people on that board with all sorts of experiences and backgrounds that you might not have as an executive, that you can benefit from. So talk with individual board members between board meetings, invite their input, have, working committees that can really help make some of your important decisions over time. So,
right. So a lot of organizations, when they're talking to their founders, really I don't know where to get good board members. I don't know. Well, there's so many ways when you really think about it. You know more people than you think. You bank at a bank that most likely has executives and bankers that like to give back, insurance brokers who might want to give back. The list goes on and on. So I guess when I get that response, well, I don't know any of these powerful, well-educated expertise, type people, where would I go? You see them every day. Just start actually looking at when you're dropping off your deposit at the bank, go in and talk to your banker. Are there any other potential places that you would recommend people look for board members?
I want to equate it a little bit to like finding a great new friend or finding your spouse.
Well, you're building a relationship, right? So absolutely.
Exactly. And those things don't just come necessarily, out of the blue and you've got the perfect board member there. Sometimes it requires some cultivation. So going outside of your normal networks, I think, is really important as well. And that helps to ensure a more diverse board that, brings in different backgrounds and perspectives and may have a better understanding of the beneficiaries that you're serving. So I think it's really important to ensure that you're thinking about the backgrounds and types of individuals, not just their skills and their work experience, but other parts of their lives that would be important to what you're doing as an organization. And then start to cultivate relationships with maybe organizations that have those people in them. So develop relationship with other organizations, cultivate some of those relationships. Oftentimes you share similar values, or your missions can be aligned on certain points. And that may be a source of board members that may not walk in overnight, that you're going to get. But if you develop relationships over a year or two, then you may find some of the best board members that you've ever thought of. But at the outset, if you don't have board members, if you're just a founder without, other people who are interested in serving on the board, and they're not just your friends who want to, let you put their name on a piece of paper and don't, want to do anything else. But if you don't find some real board members who want to do the substantive work of being on a board, maybe you're not quite ready to start a nonprofit organization yet, or maybe you should start out by incubating the project with a fiscal sponsor and an advisory board that doesn't have to have the fiduciary duties and might be easier to recruit for, and later spin it off once you have more buy-in. Because if you don't have people who are willing to serve on the board, it might be difficult for that organization to have sort of long-term viability.
I couldn't agree more. Well, thank you so much, Jean, for being on the Nonprofit Counsel podcast. I'm sure we'll speak with you again in the future, because this has been, we could have gone off on another 5 topics that, we could totally have a conversation about. So thank you again.
It's my great pleasure, May. And thank you for developing the Nonprofit Counsel. I think that's a great new resource for the sector.
Thank you, Jean.
Thank you for listening to the Nonprofit Counsel podcast. Are you ready to lead with clarity and confidence? Head to nonprofitcounsel.com to find the tools you need to start smart, lead strong, and create lasting impact.